In. All right, good morning. I'm Jeff Hammond, Executive Director at International Ground Source Heat Pump Association. Thank you so much for joining us for the February IGSHPA Dig Deeper webinar. We appreciate our sponsor today, Climate Master. They're manufacturers of water source and geothermal heat pumps, and they're sponsoring the Dig Deeper for February. I have just a few announcements to bring everyone up to date on the latest IGSHPA news, and then I'll introduce the speakers. So thanks again for joining us. All right. First announcement here is if you go to the website, IGSHPA.org, there's a training and events calendar button. If you'd like to speak at one of these town hall or Dig Deeper webinars, feel free to go to that link and fill out an abstract. We do still have some openings for 2024, so we'd love to hear from you if you have some topics that you'd like to work with us on. All right. And also I want you to save the date. Our next annual conference is March 11th through the 13th, 2025. So it's a little bit more than a year. Our last conference was December 2023. So we'll have just a few months past that so that this can be a spring conference rather than a December conference. Save the date. You'll see a lot more information here soon. There'll be registration, hotel information, and so forth. Also, our research conference is in Montreal, May the 28th through the 30th, 2024, so it's not too far away. We have quite a few papers for this research conference, and you'll find the registration online at IGSHPA.org. So that'll be a very interesting a number of topics there from all over the world, really. We have, I think, five to seven countries, if I remember right. Geo Outlook magazine is back. Hopefully you saw our January edition, and we are accepting now articles and advertising for July. So contact us if you would like to participate. This magazine now goes to about 50,000 people. We have 6,000 or so in the IGSHPA audience, but we're partnering with BNP Media, which is the publisher for Engineered System, the news, and quite a few more. So with the addition of that audience, we have about 50,000. If you didn't happen to see the January issue, please let us know. We've had some challenges. Some IT departments at some of our members have unsubscribed automatically from the IGSHPA mailing list. And so it's quite possible that that might have happened to you. Google and Yahoo have changed their policies as well. So if you're not getting emails from IGSHPA and you didn't see this January issue, please let us know, because that's how we notify IGSHPA members of their membership expiration, certification, and so forth. So just a quick note on that. If you would like to be a member and you're not already, we have a brand new membership program. It actually has quite a bit more to offer. More options. There are some retired and student rates, lower rates for schools and community organizations. So some lower entry and also some benefactor rates for those who want to have a little bit more commitment to IGSHPA. We have discounted certification renewals for members, which is new, and all that's on the website at IGSHPA.org. As a member, there are some new options here on the member portal. If you haven't been to the member portal, one of them that you'll see is this marketing resources link. We're working with a company called MediaMark Spotlight, and so you'll find lots of social media posts, videos, and so forth that are accessible to members for promoting geothermal as well as your company. If you're looking for CEUs for your certification, if you would, please send us a message in the chat with your name and email, and we'll keep track of those for you. We have a new way to obtain those CEUs. If you're watching this as a recording, please make sure that you include this Dig Deeper webinar code as well as your name and with your email, and send that to info@igshpa.org. And you'll get credit. If you're watching this live, don't worry about this. Just send it in the chat. But if you're watching this recorded, you'll need this code in order to get credit. Just some housekeeping issues. Please send your questions in the chat once our speakers are finished. I will read those questions and we'll have some time for Q&A. There's also a new feature in this webinar that's called Q&A. So you can use either the chat or the Q&A feature. I know there's some issues with some people accessing chat. As I mentioned, it seems like security is taking a whole new turn and blocking some people from being able to use that. So my next slide hopefully will give you some pointers there. If you can't use the chat, you might see something like this on your screen that says that you've been invited to the meeting chat. You'll have to click OK or it won't let you chat. So that's one possible option. You can also use the Q&A. It'll show up on the top here. And then if all else fails, just raise your hand and I'll make sure that we unmute everyone and you'll be able to ask that question live. So hopefully that will take care of it. A quick disclaimer and potential conflict of interest, and then we'll turn it over to our speakers with just a quick introduction. The upcoming presentation represents the opinion of the presenter and does not represent any official position, opinion, or endorsement of any products or services by IGSHPA or its members. IGSHPA Town Halls and Dig Deeper webinars are for member updates and education on the latest information in the geothermal heat pump industry and are not meant to endorse one technology or brand over another. It is the presenter's responsibility to disclose any conflict of interest or position that may arise in the content of this webinar. All right, I'm happy to announce our speakers now. I'll read a quick overview. Thanks again to Climate Master for sponsoring. Electorate, feel free to share your screen whenever you like. All right, so we have 3 speakers today. Wesley Sherrod is General Manager of Corechem. His grandfather, an analytical chemist at Oak Ridge, founded the company in 1981. Wesley has been with Corechem for 23 years and is the 3rd generation of the family business. From operations to general manager, he has touched every aspect of Corechem. Randy Holt, our second speaker, is business development manager at Corechem. He started as purchasing manager in 2006. Transitioned into marketing and business development in 2014. Randy strives to bring the Corechem brand of heat transfer fluid in front of an ever-expanding audience interested in sustainable energy. Ben Holt, the thermal fluids manager at Corechem, started in 2018. Ben has been instrumental in the growth of Corechem's heat transfer fluid section, which has quadrupled in the last 2 years alone. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to Corechem for our Dig Deeper today. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Jeff. And thanks everyone for joining this presentation. And some of the points we're going to cover around freeze protection and water quality in ground source heat pumps, geothermal systems, are the proper flushing and purging of closed loop systems, water quality and how it matters to the life of your HTF and the system, importance of system freeze protection, the different types of heat transfer fluids and pros and cons of each, preparation of closed loop systems to inhibit biofouling, proper concentration of heat transfer fluid of choice, the maintenance and annual testing and monitoring of the HTF or water, and then the makeup water HTF systems. So on the closed loop system flush and purge, there are very good resources available from IGSHPA and the ANSI CSA standards on flushing and purging for closed loop systems. Flushing and purging is important to remove any debris and dirt that may be in the system from installation, pipe shavings, dirt, just leftovers from equipment manufacturing, things like that, because all this has the potential to impact the system performance down the road. Maintaining the specified velocity while you're flushing and purging is important to eliminate the possibility of any dead spots in the system that will not be properly flushed. Also, making sure that all of the air is removed is critical because this can cause corrosion and scale or contribute to corrosion and scale down the road. So if you're an engineer, make sure that you're specifying the specific flush procedure in the engineering specifications, so that gets done and is included in the scope of work. If you're an installer, then you need to make sure that you have the proper equipment to flush these systems, and obviously the The larger systems require larger flushing equipment. And then if you're a property manager and owner, just verify that this is done prior to filling the system with your final water treatment or HTF. Next slide. So water quality and why it matters. Obviously, the quality of the water can have an enormous impact on system performance. Margin or poor water quality can lead to development of scale, sediment deposits, creation of sludge, heat exchangers, and coils. Most loop components are plastic, so not as much impact on those, but you still can get some degradation of fluid that impacts performance. So obviously reduces heat transfer efficiency, causes premature degradation of the fluid or the water in the system, and causes damage to the equipment, piping, and valves. Water quality specifications. So you should always meet an equipment or component manufacturer spec if there is one available. If there's not, ASHRAE Application Handbook Table 21 has a recommended water quality that covers quite a bit of analytes, and it's very important to follow this to prevent scale and corrosion in the system and also prevent degradation of the fluid itself. So typical things we're looking at are pH, total dissolved solids, iron content, alkalinity, the calcium and bicarbonate hardness, chlorides, manganese, oxygen, hydrogen sulfide, and the CO2. All of those present challenges that the water chemistry or the HTF has to overcome to maintain the life of the HTF or system water. So it's important to make sure that your water prior to commissioning meets these specifications. Additional resources are the ASHRAE Table 21. These are the few of the things they look at: stability index, saturation index, and the bacteria activation reaction test. If you're unsure of your water quality, then you need to get it tested to make sure that it's meeting that specification. A lot of times you can check with the local county or city water department or utility that you're going to be drawing the water from for the fill, and they should be able to give you a pretty good breakdown on what their water quality standard is for the specific utility. So, but again, if you can't get that from them, make sure you're getting it tested so you're starting off on the right foot. The next one is, if you can drink it, it's good enough for my hydronic system, and that's not really true. So there's a lot of minerals in water, especially drinking water, that can be detrimental to the system life and fluid life. The presence of higher levels of calcium, magnesium, iron, chlorides, sulfates, that's just a few of the things that can begin to cause corrosion and build up in the future. So anytime that there's any sort of corrosion or scaling, biofouling, anything like that, that will reduce the efficiency of the system and eventually will lead to failure. We've seen it multiple times where it's just been filled up with just plain tap water, and that's the only thing that's been done. And down the road, then there becomes problems with the system and it loses its efficiency and doesn't operate properly. In the case where the tap water or the water source that you're using, be it a well or whatever it is, does not meet the specifications or the standards, that can be processed through DI or RO, reverse osmosis, to remove the unwanted minerals and contaminants. This can be done in situ, so circulating the system through a on-site DI unit or something like that. So on the larger system, where it would be not cost effective to truck in this water, it can be set up with a portable system to actually circulate through that. So that's an option. Or reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis is sometimes slower than just running it through a DI bed, but both options are suitable. If you do have to regardless of whether you have to treat your water or not, a suitable corrosion inhibitor needs to be used. And this is important even if you're putting in a HTF that's going to include corrosion inhibitors down the road. There may be some time lag between the system commissioning or initial startup, especially on a refurbished building or something like that, and when they put the HTF in it. So adding corrosion inhibitors at the point of completion of flushing and purging is important to protect the system in that time gap if there's going to be that. So going on to the next slide, these are some of the pictures and issues we've seen with heat exchangers and geothermal systems. Obviously, the picture in the middle is scale. That's mostly in hot water hydronic, but biofouling is a big contributor to reduced efficiency or effectiveness of geothermal systems. So that's something that you want to make sure that you're controlling. Also, microbiological induced corrosion is a contributor as well. These are some pretty extreme pictures, but there's things we have seen in the field to where a geothermal system basically quits working because it can no longer effectively transfer the energy. And it also puts a lot of load on your equipment. So we've seen pump failure because of this, coil failure, where it's eating through the coils and things like that. So important to make sure that your water quality is good and that the system is properly flushed and purged prior to final inspection. Did you know that, and this is something that is in New York, but the eligibility of some rebate programs can depend on the proof of testing and flushing and purging procedures. So if you're an engineer, that's going to be a document that you're going to be wanting to get for the owner. If you're an installer, you're going to have to make sure that you keep the data where you've recorded the velocities and the times and measurements like that. So if you are going to try to utilize a rebate program or something like that, make sure you check the requirements so you don't miss out on the savings that can come from a lot of these programs that are out there. So for now, I'll hand it over to Ben to go over some of the importance of freeze protection and some of the different types of HTF.
Thank you, Wesley. So we like to refer to heat transfer fluid, or HTF, as it's known in the industry, as the lifeblood of the system. It is essential for the efficiency and the longevity of the system. Obviously, untreated water does expand when it freezes. This in turn leads to it can lead to bursting of the system and costly repairs. So you'll want to make sure that if you are using an HTF, you are using a fully formulated product, which will greatly increase the protection of your system at lower temperatures. And it's often referred to as a valuable insurance policy. Essentially, you don't necessarily see it until you need it, and then it's very nice to have it in those conditions. So there are a number of different types of heat transfer fluids for ground source heat pump systems, and choosing the correct one for the application that you have is definitely instrumental in ensuring the system is efficient and runs properly. So you want to look at some of the state and local building codes, the toxicity of the fluid, the biodegradability in case there was a spill or a leak, the viscosity and pump load within the system, the ASTM standards for corrosion and freeze protection, and then the specific heat and thermal conductivity. All these are factors that play into which heat transfer fluid you may choose. So we'll start with the age-old original, if you will, heat transfer fluid, being ethylene glycol. There are 4 major types of heat transfer fluids, which we'll go over in this presentation. However, we do see some 1,3-propane diol as well as glycerin. We don't see those as much, but we're going to go over the main 4. So ethylene glycol, um, it does have a decent freeze protection. Freeze being when ice crystals begin to form within the system. Burst protection, which is typically lower than freeze protection, is when the fluid freezes solid and then expands. So it is less viscous than propylene glycol, resulting in better flow rates and thermal performance, as well as a lower parasitic pump load. And it's a good choice for where thermal performance is a top priority. However, there are some cons with it. Mainly that it is not for use in geothermal systems. And the reason it is not is that it's extremely toxic to humans and animals. You may have a friend, or maybe it's even happened to yourself, where a dog or a cat uh, licked the antifreeze dripping from a vehicle and died. That's due to ethylene glycol. So it cannot be used in applications where contamination of drinking water is possible, such as enclosed loop geosystems, where if there was a leak to form, it could potentially contaminate the aquifers and drinking water. It's not to be used in food processing facilities, and it's harmful to terrestrial and aquatic animals when deposited into waterways. Another common fluid we see used in the field is methanol. This is a wood alcohol-based product. It has a freeze point of 0 degrees Fahrenheit at 20%. It also has great heat transfer characteristics. Then again, there are some cons. It's toxic or can even be deadly to humans from inhalation, dermal being it gets on your skin and soaks in, or oral and organ toxicity. Another drawback is that in the production of methanol, it does require the use of fossil fuels. So in turn, you are emitting significant emissions of greenhouse gases. It is a flammable product. It's restricted for use in certain jurisdictions. It is a DOT regulated fluid, so it will ship as hazardous and be handled as hazardous, including storage, which we've seen it where it can be regulated by state and local governments for the storage of the product. And you want to make sure spark proof or explosion proof equipment is used when pumping that product into a system. Another common one is ethanol. It is also another alcohol-based fluid, although instead of wood derived, it is grain derived, typically from corn. There are some pros with it, such as low corrosiveness. It's very low toxicity. It's got high heat transfer capacity and lower viscosity at lower temperatures. It has a freeze point of 15 degrees Fahrenheit at 20% dilution. Some of the cons with it being that it is a alcohol product, it also carries a lot of the same hazards as a methanol product. So you'll just want to keep that in mind. It's DOT regulated. It is flammable. And you'll want to look at the storage regulations as well as ensure you have spark-proof or explosion-proof equipment when using that and pumping it into a system. So propylene glycol, it is the go-to for closed-loop geothermal systems. We see it more often than not in engineering specs, and for good reason. It's got a lot of pros that it's non-toxic and non-hazardous. It's available in a HT1 NSF form, meaning that it is certified for incidental food contact, or even we do see that some states require that product from the standpoint of the possibility of a leak into aquifers or drinking water. There are bio-based options available from certain manufacturers. It can be used in applications where there is a possibility for drinking water to come into contact with it, and it can be used in systems where you may be installing a closed-loop geo system in a food processing facility. Typically, they will require that HT1 certification. There are some cons with propylene glycol, being that there are higher viscosities and friction loss, resulting in parasitic pump load being higher than some of the other fluids. It will primarily impact larger systems where you're moving a lot more fluid and at lower temperatures. It does have a lower heat capacity than some of the other fluids, and it does have a higher freeze point. It's 18 degrees Fahrenheit at 20% dilution. So heat transfer fluid standards, you want to make sure that any heat transfer fluid products will protect your system from corrosion and freezing. ASTM has been instrumental and developed standards to test their effectiveness, and you'll just want to make sure that any thermal fluid that you choose is meeting or exceeding those standards for optimal performance and protection. So the age-old ASTM D1834, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. It's an older standard. However, you will notice by the title that it is a corrosion test for engine coolants in glassware. It is a simple beaker type procedure that evaluates the effects of engine coolants, not heat transfer fluids for geothermal and HVAC equipment under controlled laboratory conditions. The results of this test method cannot stand alone as evidence of satisfactory corrosion inhibition in geothermal or HVAC equipment, and that's primarily due to engine coolants containing different corrosion inhibitors than what we would consider a suitable corrosion inhibitor in a geothermal fluid or a HVAC type product. There is a new standard now that ASTM has come out. They've recognized that there needs to be a new standard for heat transfer fluids in HVAC systems as well as geothermal. That is the D8039. You will see some manufacturers are starting to spec this, that they meet or exceed this standard. It is relatively new. The 16 on the end of that standard means it came out in 2016, but it's not widely recognized yet. So you will want to look at this as well. It covers the requirements of ethylene glycol, propylene glycol, 1,3-propanediol, as well as glycerin-based heat transfer fluids. It is tested at a 30% pre-dilution without any further dilution, and it ensures that they will effectively provide freeze and corrosion protection at those concentrations. So, proper concentration for the heat transfer fluid you choose. It is seen as an industry standard to select a freeze protection where the concentration will give you at least 9 degrees Fahrenheit below the anticipated ambient temperatures. This can be found on an ANSI standard or IGSHPA. It is important to note that any dilution below 25% will require additional corrosion inhibitors to inhibit corrosion as well as bacterial growth. And when you're going below 25%, using a deionized water or RO water is recommended. And there are manufacturers, there are engineers out there speccing 20% propylene glycol. So you will want to make sure if you're dealing with a project like that, just ensure that the manufacturer is aware and you are able to get the additional inhibitors required. I will now turn it back over to Wesley to finish up the presentation.
Thanks for that, Ben. So I'm going to go over a few of the common types of inhibitors used in HTF products or water treatment if you're in a climate that doesn't require HTF. So you have the phosphate-based inhibitors. They form an electric buffer to reduce corrosion. Nitrite-based, this is actually a film forming, and it is recommended where water quality may be a concern. Typically on a phosphate, if you're dealing with some harder waters going in, you might get some fallout of the phosphate inhibitor. So nitrite's a good option for that. There's molybdate-based products, and those are becoming more common. So in systems with molybdate, one advantage is that you can typically get by with a lot less concentration of the molybdate inhibitor in a system. So and then the azoles, those are preventing metallic degradation in copper, brass, bronze, other yellow metals. So any properly formulated HTF or corrosion inhibitor that you would add to a system is going to have probably one of the top three, and then the azole in there as an addition to protect any yellow metals. So the top three are good for stainless steel and cast iron, ductile iron, whatever else may be in the system, but then the azoles have to be in there for yellow metals. The picture on this slide is interesting. This is actually one we did here in our office, taking just plain water or an ethanol-based heat transfer fluid without proper corrosion inhibitors, and then one with proper corrosion inhibitors. And that picture was taken after about a 3-month exposure. And then, so you can see there, that's just a basic nail, but some of how quickly scale rust and fluid degradation can begin to occur in a system like that. So that's why it's important to make sure that even if you're not using an HTF, you still need to add good corrosion protection. So we are seeing some question about whether the state prohibits the use of an HTF or inhibitor. There are some states that specify a food grade product must be used. Example, Minnesota requires that an HTF meets ANSI 60 or the NSF HT1. So ANSI 60 standard is potable water chemistry. Typically wouldn't see that in an HTF. The HT1 standard is the incidental food contact. So that's certifying that the product that bears that mark is okay if it happens to come in contact with something that's produced as a food or a beverage. So the states that Minnesota has adopted that as their standard. So in case there is a leak or something and it does get into the aquifer, there's not the risk of something happening is greatly reduced. So make sure that you're checking state regulations when you're installing or designing geothermal. And the Department of Natural Resources is typically who we see regulating those kind of things. So biological growth, any fully formulated HTF generally has enough protection against biological growth at concentrations 25% or greater. But make sure that if you're running less than 25%, the precautions or actions have been taken to mitigate that biological growth. The best way to combat this problem is the proper flushing, purging, and treatment of the system prior to adding an HTF. So prepping a closed loop system, there's a couple of ways you can do that. Through the sodium hypochlorite flush, which is just a basic bleach at 50 ppm. There's instructions on how to do it on some of that, some of the different websites. IGSHPA, I think, has some standards on that. So you don't have to flush near as fast when you're doing this because dwell time is what you want, but you have to bring the system up to a ppm, 50 ppms, and then that has to stay in there for 24-hour retention time. If you're using a sodium hypochlorite flush, it is critical that you take that you flush that heavily fluorinated water back out before you introduce your HTF or your corrosion inhibitors, because that just gives that much more chemical that those things have to overcome, especially the chlorine molecule. The other option is to introduce a biocide per manufacturer's instructions. There are a number of options out there for biocides designed and registered to use in closed loop systems. So anytime you use one, make sure that it is a registered product and it has instructions for closed loop hydraulic systems. Typically, we see a biocide can be used to treat a system and then left in the system. It doesn't have to be flushed out like a sodium hypochlorite flush. So that's one advantage of using a biocide versus the hypochlorite. The hypochlorite, however, is a lot more effective. So if you have a heavy load of biological growth, you'll get a lot quicker action with the hypochlorite flush method. And then, so once the hydraulic system's been filled, it needs to be maintained. And this is critical, and it's something that we see in the past years as something that's possibly not looked at as much as it should be. But any heat transfer or fluid, it should be tested 90 days after the system startup, and then adjusted based on the test results. And then at a very minimum, an annual inspection will need to take place. The fluid, if there's a leak, if there's air in the system, if there's a low spot or something that's causing flow restrictions, all those things can have a major impact on system performance and your fluid health. So they can happen fairly quickly, but typically in a closed loop system, minimum annual inspection is what needs to be specified. And so if you're a contractor, obviously, a lot of those things you're responsible for it for a year. That is a precaution that you need to take, because checking it more often in that first year is recommended. So what should you test for? Obviously a visual analysis of the fluid. That includes the color, any visual sediment, particulate matter that may have not gotten out with the flush or that was trapped somewhere. And once the system is heated up, cooled down a few times, it's breaking something loose. Your base fluid concentration be tested with hydrometer or refractometer, the pH of the fluids, any reserve alkalinities, corrosion inhibitors, fluid degradation. So that's going to be apparent in your reduced reserve alkalinity or a major change in pH, any corrosive ions, chlorides or sulfates, and other degradation products that might tell you that there's corrosion in the system, copper, iron, things like that. And then obviously monitoring for the presence of biological and organic growth. Biological and organic growth typically has to be done in a lab. So if you suspect that, it has to be sent off and cultured properly. If you do have that, then it needs to be treated. Once the treatment's complete, another test is done. So hydrometers, these are a few of the devices that you can use if you're an installer. You can use these to check the fluid health in the field. However, if you have any doubt or if there's something that you're not quite sure about, sending it to a lab of some sort or a fluid manufacturer is a really good way to get it tested and an analysis sent back to you with some recommendations. So in hydrometers, that's the measures the concentration of fluid through buoyancy. You have to have the proper equipment to do that. So while it can be done, a refractometer is a lot simpler way of doing it. So that just measures the light refraction, and it's used to identify the quantity of heat transfer fluid. Most refractometers are calibrated to the specific heat transfer fluid that's in the system. So if you have a propylene glycol in your system, you need to make sure your refractometer is set up for propylene. pH, you can determine the pH of the system, see whether it's going acid or if you're maintaining your pH that was at the beginning, and then any inhibitor test kits. So there's test kits out there that you can get for field testing of nitrites, of phosphates, of molybdates, and of the azoles. So these are just some things that you can use if you're an installer or a property owner to check your system to make sure that your fluid is maintaining its health. So, and then makeup system. So this is very important because the makeup of a system needs to be the same fluid that's in the system. So if you run at a 20% propylene glycol heat transfer fluid in your system, your makeup tank, pump, whatever, it needs to have that same fluid in it. So as you're making up, if it does need made up, you're making up with the same thing. You're not either further diluting your inhibitors or further diluting your freeze protection. So on the makeup and the test, it's very helpful to keep that data somewhere so you can look at it from test point to test point and see if there's something that is changing, because any change in data can help you detect whether there's a leak in the system maybe, or there's some fluid degradation starting to happen. So that wraps up our presentation, Jeff. So I guess see if we got any questions, we'll try to answer them.
We have a bunch of really good questions. Thanks, guys. This is such an important topic for our industry. I really appreciate you taking the time. It was a great presentation. So we won't delay here. Greg has a question. At what % concentration are methanol and ethanol no longer flammable?
It's pretty dilute. I don't know the exact percentage off the top of my head, but it's down in the single digits. So okay, you're going to get very little freeze protection at the point of no flammability. So it's not as flammable at 20%. It's not going to be like gasoline or something like that at 20%, but if there was a fire and you had a leak or something, it's going to burn.
So care still needs to be taken if handling alcohols.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Our next question is from William. He wants to know, what are the best practices for determining the type of heat transfer fluid in a system where there's no record of it?
That's something that's usually typically going to have to be done in the lab, because there's a lot of different instrumentation that you can use to determine that. We utilize either gas chromatography or liquid chromatography for that. Sometimes you can tell by the odor, but if you don't have experience, that's probably not the best way to try to figure it out.
You should probably be working with your local heat transfer supplier and use their knowledge. Okay. William has a couple of other questions here. What inhibitors are recommended for methanol-based heat transfer fluids at 20% or greater?
We've seen the most success with nitrite or molybdate-based in alcohol fluids. The alcohol fluid we manufacture is a molybdate nitrite blend, so it works well in those types of HTFs.
Okay. And I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but you can't really overdose with a molybdate type inhibitor. Is that true? You can put a little bit more in?
Yeah, you can. And the thing about a molybdate is and why you can do that is it doesn't affect your pH near as much as some of the phosphate or the nitrite inhibitors. So it's 50 to 100 ppm is sufficient, but if you get 250 ppm in there, you're not going to tear nothing up or degrade the efficiency of the system or fluid.
Great. Okay. Let me go to the next question here. All kinds of good questions. Does Corechem offer pints, gallons, or pails of straight inhibitors for those times when 20% propylene glycol is specified on a job?
Ben, you want to take that one? I guess for myself, we'll try to help a customer any way we can. So if that's what they need, we'll try to help them out. We prefer to sell a fully formulated one just because we have a lot more control over that. But in a system where, it's not practical, we understand that, and we do sell a standalone inhibitor package for that. So.
Yeah, I've seen where, sometimes you only need 20%, for example, I think is where he's going with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Larry asked the question, what does reverse alkalinity tell us?
Reserve alkalinity, that's basically the horsepower that the fluid has to overcome any acid degradation or something that's wanting to degrade the fluid. Where you typically see acid degradation is more in the higher temperatures. So a ground source heat pump doesn't really operate extremely hot, but anything above like 140 degrees, if your fluid's not properly protected and got some good reserve alkalinity, you can start to see that acid form and your pH will start to drop.
Okay, good to know. So I guess the geothermal fluids should last longer than boiler fluid too, then, if that's the case.
Yeah.
Okay, Howard has a really good question here about commercial systems. Does Corechem have a written specification for geothermal systems?
Randy? Oh, go ahead, Ben.
Nope, I was going to say we do have engineering specification packets available for a host of products that are manufactured.
And they can find those on your website, I assume?
They are not readily available on our website, but we are able to provide that if contacted.
Okay, excellent. Adib has a question here about another type of heat transfer fluid. It says he mentioned here 4 types of heat transfer fluid were reviewed. Kilfrost Geo is one. What type is that? Are you familiar with that brand?
Yeah, we've heard that brand. I'm not exactly sure what it is. They're not prevalent in the US, so we don't really run into it a lot. But they do claim to have some better properties than straight propylene glycol, although it is a propylene glycol based fluid. So there's definitely something else in there. But all the data points they have relate fairly closely to PG as far as freeze point, viscosity, and thermal conductivity and things like that. Their viscosity is better though. So
very interesting. I'm sure there are all kinds of new formulations that are in the works as systems become more popular. William has another question about best practices. Oh, I'm sorry, I already asked that one. Dan has a question. Can ethanol and methanol be mixed? And if so, is there any way to properly test the freeze protection?
From a compatibility standpoint, you wouldn't have any issues mixing methanol and ethanol, but it's going to be hard to truly determine the freeze point because the alcohol makeups are slightly different. So a refractometer is not going to see one versus the other. It's only going to see the one that it's looking for. So if you had 10% methanol and 20% ethanol, it's only going to see the 10% methanol.
Okay.
So you could, it's probably pretty close if you measured it with a hydrometer and got specific gravity and back calculated that to the freeze point, but depends on how involved you want to get, I guess.
Probably don't want to do it is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's never a good idea to mix different types of fluids just from strictly a testing and verification standpoint.
Okay. I thought this was going to be a popular webinar. We have still more questions. So Janine asks, should a makeup fluid tank work like a buffer tank and be part of the circulating fluid so as to enable visual inspection?
I'm not an engineer. I've never seen one set up like that, but I don't know if there'd be anything detrimental to it being operated like that.
Okay. Okay. And there are, quite a few systems on the market for makeup water, that feed systems that have, a lot of really nice features. Larry asks the question, does ChemCore offer fluid testing and at what cost?
We do offer fluid testing, and that is free of charge to the customer.
Wasn't that cool? Okay. Dan has a question about inhibitors. How long do they last with a system with 20% ethanol?
There's a few different factors, but typically if your water quality is good and you don't have air in your system, they're going to last a while because it's not like a boiler system or something that water is there. And unless there's a leak or a major equipment failure, it's the same water all the time. So you're just constantly topping it up a little bit. Maybe if you get some, if your makeup tank's topping it up, but if your makeup tank has the same product in it, there should be no substantial loss of inhibitors over the time. Again, it kind of goes back to that annual testing recommendation to just make sure. I mean, we've seen systems that have gone 18 to 20 years. We've seen systems that were so fouled up after 3 years, they wouldn't even operate. So
testing's the key and planning up front. Sounds like that's great.
Yep.
Peter has a question. What type of inhibitors can be added to a system with only deionized water?
Any of the three. Typically you're going to see the nitrite or molybdate based is what's readily available as just a standalone corrosion inhibitor because it can be concentrated a lot more than the phosphates in a liquid. So yeah, nitrite or molybdate. And there's a few products. We make a couple products. We make a nitrite product, and we're currently developing a molybdate based that can be used for ground source heat pumps. So
okay, that's great. Joe has a question about distilled water usage. I know you had some slides on DI and RO water. Can you talk a little bit about the advantages of each versus potable water? So we really have those three choices, I guess. What's on site, I suppose, if it's good quality versus DI and RO.
Yeah. Distilled water, I mean, it can be used. It's cleaner than DI water. Sometimes, mostly it's just not cost effective. But if you had a really small system and you could go down to Walmart and buy 100 gallons of distilled water to top your system up, it's not gonna, there's no big advantage or disadvantage against RO or DI water. The big thing about using DI or RO is it's cleaning up the tap water. That it's going to have extra stuff in there that you don't want in your system. You don't need it, so why have it clogging up your it could create fallout because of the inhibitors. It gives something else for the inhibitor to have to try to overcome. So it's working harder. So you might get depletion of the inhibitors faster. So there's no real disadvantage to using distilled water other than most of the time it's not cost effective.
Makes sense. Mark has a question about the sampling services, testing services that you provide, asking if you can elaborate on what exactly is that service that you provide to customers, what types of testing?
So essentially, you will place an order. We have an online link to a sample collection kit or analysis, and we receive that in, send you a collection kit. It comes with a prepaid return label, and you fill out the information on the form as well as an online information and send that back to us. Once received in, we test for all of the items mentioned on the maintenance slide of the presentation and provide that back to you in a timely manner. And that is, like mentioned, completely free of charge.
Okay, very good. Jay has a question. Will you be offering full service in any locations, telemetry observations?
That is something we're working on developing right now, is a program for that. We utilize it currently to monitor tank levels at different locations and things like that. But we're working on a full suite of inline pH, conductivity, inline refractometers that we can actually monitor the fluid life in real time, basically.
Okay, great. And I have another question from Dan. He wants to know what temperature range promotes biogrowth.
I don't know if I could specify. I mean, usually biological likes warm, wet places, which typically is fairly prevalent in a geothermal system. So you have to get it pretty hot to kill it, I think, but I'm not a scientist on that, so don't quote me.
Okay. We definitely want inhibitors, though, as I think that eliminates those problems.
Yep.
Stephen doesn't have a question, but he does have he did post in the chat if anybody's interested in that question that Howard had earlier about specifications. Stephen says, responding to a question on specifications, Department of Defense has specifications. See UFGS 238147, and he has a link there. So if anybody's interested in specifications, that's available as well. It sounds like Corechem has specifications for heat transfer fluid. So timing wise, we only have about a minute left, just enough time. If any of you three guys want to wrap up, I certainly appreciate your time. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I thank you very much.
Well, we appreciate everybody getting on, and hopefully we've been of some value. And any questions, feel free to reach out to one of the three of us, and we'll try to help you out. Ben, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say, Jeff, we greatly appreciate the opportunity, and we value our relationship with IGSHPA and each one of you on the meeting. It's something that is definitely needed in the industry, is just some instruction from, say, the beginning all the way through to fluid maintenance on the end. So appreciate everybody taking the time, and we look forward to connecting and speaking with you all soon.
Yep. Excellent. Well, thanks again. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see everybody again on the next webinar.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all.